Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh, and thank you again for tuning in to MintPress News' Behind the Headline. We're a citizen-led project created in partnership with Free Speech TV. And this show is made possible by viewers like you. So if you want to learn about our citizen and conscious business sponsors, visit our website at mintpressnews.com. Now let's get behind the headline. An education crisis largely orchestrated by neoconservatives in both the Republican and Democratic parties has left some of the country's oldest and most prestigious public universities struggling under deep cuts and severe budget shortfalls. And although these cuts are driven mostly by conservative think tanks, the changing face of education isn't just about austerity. It's no coincidence that some of the deepest cuts have come against social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, all subjects that are traditionally the target of some of the GOP's harshest critics. And despite these staggering cuts, though, football coaches continue to earn massive record salaries. And simultaneously, thanks to rising tuition costs and a poor job market, students are struggling under record-breaking levels of debt. It's an economic bubble that some predict could burst with devastating effects similar to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. And our old friends at Wall Street are ready to step into the gaps created by the neocons' cuts, offering a new form of education, one that treats learning as a commodity and students as consumers. Now, neocons in Congress have argued for allowing more for-profit universities to receive accreditation, while the Investing in Student Success Act would see students become indentured servants of big corporations in return for their education. Now, to learn more about the devastating effect this is having on young people's futures, I'm joined today by Steve Mims, the writer and director of Starving the Beast, a 2016 documentary about the privatization of public education that premiered in March at the SXSW Film Festival. And I first asked him to explain how think tanks like the Heritage Foundation want to transform education and what's really wrong with more for-profit colleges. Check it out.
Our film is about a radical approach to public universities. And so you kind of have to section it off from for-profit schools. I mean, that was the thing that's already happening, is still happening, but the kind of movement to change the nature of the whole structural nature of public universities is what our film is about. And those guys basically, by around 2008, started formulating ideas for changing the whole nature of how public universities are funded, how they're organized in terms of tenure, how they would like to see research essentially separated from teaching, and the migration of the funds for research going into the private sector. And so, that reform movement that started in 2008 came after about 30 years of reduced funding for public higher ed. And what happened, this is what the film was kind of framed, what happened is, the funding in general is around 60% state funding for public universities. And by this year, it's down to around 12%. And so that gradual decline has shifted the burden of cost from the over onto the families and onto the students. And so by 2008, there was already a bigger uproar about that because, as you know, like the story about public higher ed, about higher ed in general, is about student debt. And so you have a situation that's been caused by this defunding, and then the solution to it was proposed by think tanks. And so that's the nature of how they got involved with trying to radically change the way public universities work.
And Steve, I'm really glad you talked about that because a lot of your movie, Starving the Beast, is a debate between education as a public good and education as a commodity and students as consumers. Why is it so damaging to look at education in that lens?
Well, it's just two different ways of looking at the same problem. And so initially, when public universities were invented, if you can go all the way back to UVA and to the University of North Carolina, the people there knew that they needed to give people who weren't wealthy a way to get an excellent public education. Those schools are excellent today. And if you look at what happened in 1862 when Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act into law, that provided federal funding, federal land basically, to be used to finance schools all over the country. And so now, all these years later, we have these really important economic engines all over the country that are public higher ed schools and that are very elite. So we can have places like UT Austin and the University of Wisconsin that are competitive with the highly funded private schools. And so, but that was done with an idea that we're gonna take the state's money, we're gonna pour it into these schools, and that money's going to come back to us through people who are well educated, who are going to live there and make the states better. And that's really been the secret in many ways to the success of the United States, is that we have these accessible, excellent programs. So that was it's a public good. It's like you're going to do that. The alternate view now is a more libertarian view that says that if you're going to walk out of a school like the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree that has a market value, then you should be prepared to cover the cost of that or pay cover a lot more of that burden. And so from a financial standpoint, that's the logic. And then there's the business standpoint where they look at it and say, like, look, these are bloated, inefficient institutions. They have bad labor contracts, as exemplified by tenure, and they're outdated. In the days of Google and what we have now, that these things are relics and they need to be rebuilt. The thing that we've seen happen is that we now have students who have enormous debt. It's harder. It's a question of access, about people getting into these schools, and ultimately, it's about the long-term prognosis for the country in terms of whether or not we're going to continue to have truly excellent schools, or if they're going to be diminished. And which is another part of this idea, is that the idea is that, like, it costs too much to run these places. They've got to teach more people. They've got to charge less. So are we going to let that happen? Is that a good strategy for the country? Or is it a better strategy to say, like, look, we're now realizing that the reduction in funds is severe, and, like, you can see it as a conflict and as a potentially terrible development for really important universities all over the country, and universities that aren't elite. Like, it's an issue for all these public universities, how they can survive in the face of a logic and a campaign that says, look, we can't afford to do this anymore, and if we're going to continue to do it, it's going to be on radically different terms.
And we just have 2 minutes left here, but I really want to talk about the point that you just made about really high tuition costs. What are income share agreements, and how would the Investing in Student Success Act change how students pay for their education?
Well, this is a really kind of amazing thing. It's in the film, and it is a law. It's not been passed. It's a bill that would make it possible for people to basically sell themselves to an entity like a corporation or an individual who would basically, and when I say sell themselves, what happens is you approach a corporation and you say, I'm going to major in whatever. And they say, okay, here's your tuition money. We'll pay for your education. Well, the deal is that in exchange for that, you're to pay them up to 15% of your income for up to 30 years. You're talking about a lifetime's worth of work where you will pay 15%, and that, obviously, if you're successful, that percentage will go up over a lifetime. So that is an option that's a legitimate piece of legislation that's been proposed that a lot of people think is a good solution. And it gets a great response in the film because it's a shocking proposal if you think about the ramifications of it. And you can also see where you'd have a kid who comes 18, 19 years old, and they hear that, and they go like, wow, well, this is an acceptable opportunity for me, and not really realizing the ramifications of that. So it's just one of many things that have been proposed to change not just the rules for how these schools work, but the financing of a public education.
Right, and that makes total sense because tuition really is becoming so expensive for students. Thank you so much, Steve Mims, director of Starving the Beast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
In October, USA Today listed 16 times President Obama said that there would be no boots on the ground in Syria. The report came on the heels of Obama's plan to send in 50 special ops troops, though reportedly not for combat. But flash forward to April 25th. What went from no boots on the ground to 50 boots on the ground suddenly became 250 boots on the ground. And while the State Department has pointed out that it specifically does not dispute the fact that we have boots on the ground and they are indeed wearing boots, these soldiers don't qualify as boots on the ground in the administration's calculus. It's important to note, though, that we don't put these semantics aside. There are important distinctions to be made between large-scale ground troops on combat missions and those being deployed in an aid and assist capacity, as the latest wave of boots on the ground in Syria and 4,000 troops in Iraq are currently deployed. Yet given the ongoing propaganda train that's pushing for U.S. intervention inside Syria, it's become increasingly difficult to believe that these 250 ground troops will be the extent of U.S. involvement there. Of course, even without sending in any troops, the United States and its allies like NATO members and Gulf states have already intervened in Syria, and they've been manipulating and provoking events there since 2006. But what does this intervention look like so far, and what should we expect moving forward? Here to pull back the curtain on the forces at work inside Syria to push for a humanitarian intervention is Vanessa Beeley, an investigative journalist who covers the Middle East for 21st Century Wire and who has been at the forefront of exposing that propaganda train. She discusses the media manipulation putting a pro-humanitarian interventionist spin on the Syrian crisis that's left 300,000 Syrians dead, over 3 million roaming the world as refugees, and 6.5 million internally displaced. Check it out. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd really like to start the conversation about the so-called moderate rebels and freedom fighters that make up the Syrian opposition. But some have argued that this couldn't be further from the truth, with analysts describing them as takfiri extremists. What's in it for the mainstream media to downplay or wholly ignore the reality of anti-Assad forces?
Well, I think since we've seen this war of aggression that's been conducted against Syria with the sole intent of regime change in Syria to serve US and NATO hegemony and geopolitical objectives, but not only in Syria but in the region, we've seen a Western media moving in lockstep, if you like, with those objectives, following the imperialist roadmap to the letter, basically, very rarely deviating from a narrative that serves the US and NATO propaganda and objectives in Syria. And so it's not surprising, particularly with recent events, that we're seeing a media that never questions, that never seems to investigate, that is never objective, and that never ever questions the narrative that is put forward by either the US and EU governments or by their proxy NGO humanitarian NGO complex that is situated in Syria itself.
Right, and just as the government opposition is framed as noble, the U.S. and its allies have sold so-called humanitarian interventionist groups like White Helmets and Avaz as brave volunteers and first responders who save lives inside Syria. The mainstream media has obviously been more than happy to promote that notion, but you've actually argued otherwise. You've done extensive research on who funds these groups and where they kind of erupted. Tell us about the White Helmets And who are they exactly? And how does that fit into the Assad is killing his own people pro-interventionist narrative?
I'll try to keep it as brief as I possibly can because it's a fairly complex and intricate apparatus that's been set up to propagandize the war against Syria and demonize Assad and vilify the Syrian Arab Army, which is always described as Assad's forces, which detracts from the fact that the Syrian Arab Army, one, is fighting to defend its homeland against invading hordes of proxy mercenaries, rapists, beheaders, and terrorists launched upon them by the US and NATO. But we also have, as you say, the White Helmets, who are portrayed as these neutral, impartial, unarmed heroes, these icons of humanity that claim to be saving all Syrians across the board. I mean, this is one of their great claims. A second claim that they make is that they are fiercely independent, that they take no funding from any government organizations or directly from any government. If we go back to, if you remember, an organization called MoveOn.org, that was set up by, it's actually a Democratic Party organization that was set up to divert people away from Clinton's dalliances during his presidency. MoveOn.org and Res Publica set up a company called Avaz. Avaz is, if you like, it's a petitioning site with millions of members that is used to, one, gauge public opinion, but also to change public opinion. The directors of Avaz then set up a company called Purpose. Purpose is, if you like, a Manhattan-based PR marketing agency. So if you're seeing the chain develop here, I also have to say that all of these organizations have strong connections to powerful United States foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefellers, George Soros. Purpose then went on to create, if you like, the anti-Assad or the anti-Syria propaganda brigade, which consists of the Syria campaign, White Helmets, with Syria, Medics on the Fire, and various others that have joined the throng since it was formulated. The White Helmets were set up in 2013 by a British military contractor, a mercenary basically, who served in various areas where NATO in particular had intervened, like Kosovo, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, Yemen, Palestine. He was drafted in 2013 to set up this ostensibly humanitarian organization. But what has to be made clear that this neutral organization started with seed funding from the Syrian opposition of $300,000. It has then gone on to accrue donations from both the UK and the US governments. From the UK, £19 million, and from the US via US aid, $23 million. Now, this was admitted by the State Department last week when they actually deported the leader of the White Helmets, Raed Salah. And the reasons that Mark Turner gave for the deportation of Raed Salah was possible extremist connections. So we have this complete dichotomy here. We have a humanitarian group that is embedded solely and exclusively in terrorist-held areas in Syria. So they are not helping universally across Syria. They are helping terrorist organizations in Syria. They are armed. We have images of them holding arms alongside al-Nusra, for example. So we have this humanitarian NGO that is supposedly non-government funded, which is government funded, which is working in areas that are opposed to Assad, that are producing propaganda that serves the US-NATO narrative.
And I'd really like to go off the point that you just made with how this narrative is really controlled, especially with the recent Aleppo is burning hashtag over the MSF Doctors Without Borders hospital airstrike. Obviously, evidence has been pointing to Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra rebels as perpetrating this attack, but the Aleppo is Burning campaign is painting it as if it's Assad killing his own people. Tell me more about how you've challenged this narrative.
Well, again, this is very interesting. Just to go very, very quickly into the situation in Aleppo to try and explain it as briefly as I can, so that people are aware, we're starting to unravel this entire Al-Quds hospital story, and it's proving very rapidly to be a false flag, in the sense that when we speak to doctors that are based in Aleppo, like Dr. Nabil Anfaki, Dr. Zahir Hajo, who are based in Aleppo. One is head of forensic medicine in Aleppo, another is a practicing doctor there. They have basically said that the Al-Quds hospital did not exist before the war on Syria started. So in other words, it's a temporary triage hospital that has been set up either in an existing building or in a temporary building in the eastern part of Aleppo, which is terrorist held. It's al-Nusra held. So the White Helmets and this hospital are based in an entirely terrorist-held area. In the western part of Aleppo are over 1.5 million to 2 million residents of Aleppo that have either fled from the eastern to the western or are living in the western area under government control in safety and protection from the terrorist factions. When this entire propaganda storm broke, what we found was, when we dug behind the Aleppo is Burning hashtag, we found yet again the familiar propagandists. One is the Syria campaign that we've already spoken about, that is in partnership with the White Helmets. Then we found Rami Jarrah, who used to be Alexander Page funded and certainly supported by Avaz in the early days of the revolution, when he justified the news reports that were going out demonizing Assad. Rami Jarrah now is co-founder of MintPress. MintPress is funded by Soros. Rami Jarrah is pivotal in producing anti-Assad propaganda from inside Aleppo, where he is based, again, in the al-Nusra held areas. And when this entire propaganda storm broke, it was Rami Jarrah who basically launched, with various other colleagues, this Aleppo is Burning campaign. So yet again, we're seeing what is proving to be a false narrative that has not been investigated by mainstream media, that is being produced by the well-known marketing campaign team that is working absolutely non-stop against Assad and against the Syrian government, and by default against the Syrian people. Because by producing this propaganda, by misleading and deceiving people, they are endorsing and facilitating the massacres of the Syrian people that we've seen over the last 4 days.
Right, and this obviously all looks way too familiar to all of us who've been covering war for the last decade. How does the media coverage of Syria today compare with the media coverage in the lead up to the Iraq War? I mean, is the media narrative on Syria and pushing U.S. intervention the same as it did in Iraq 13 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing absolutely no difference. The lies that took us into the wars in Iraq and in Libya, if we remember the incubator babies, if we remember the weapons of mass destruction, if we remember the rape charges thrown against Gaddafi's soldiers in Benghazi, all of which have been disproven. If we then consider that Syria has been resisting US and NATO neocolonialism for over 5 years, then we expect to see the propaganda increase commensurate with that resistance. And so therefore that is what we should be very aware of. I don't think we've ever seen the extent of disgusting propaganda that we've seen levied against Syria in the last 5 years. By the way, another thing, on the back of this Aleppo is Burning campaign, we see the familiar no-bomb zone. We've gone through no-fly zone, we've gone through safe zones, we're now in the no-bomb zone. So we're seeing these people pushing again for a no-fly zone, which we know means fundamentally that we're heading towards the US NATO objective of a failed state similar to one that we've seen in Libya. And we're also seeing very lucrative funding projects coming out of this that have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in the last 4 days alone. Are we seeing crowdfunding for terrorism now?
And Vanessa, we just have a couple of minutes left, but with Obama's 250 new troops that are being sent to Syria under the pretext of aiding the fight against Daesh, in your analysis, how does this move actually constitute anything other than fighting ISIS?
Well, I mean, you know, to talk about 250 operatives going into Syria to fight Daesh. I mean, sorry, I do have to laugh slightly when we consider the sheer number of US proxies that are on the ground in Syria right now. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands, and we're talking 5,000 more terrorists that have apparently crossed the borders from Turkey into Syria in the last few days alone. So these 250 force is, to me, it's simply another way of putting US operatives on the ground. In a sense, it's a human shield operation because they can, to some extent, prevent Russia from striking them in particular areas if they claim that they have their own operatives. To me, it's a complete fallacy, putting people on the ground to fight Daesh when they've been creating and aiding and abetting and funding and arming Daesh from day one. And not only in Syria, but in Yemen as well. What we must also be aware of is while this Aleppo story is being amplified and is taking up all of our media time and attention, meanwhile, the American Creek mission is going apace in Yemen with the landing of 100 US Army Rangers in Lodz today.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining me today. Vanessa Beeley, investigative journalist and political analyst for 21st Century Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Check me out on Facebook and Twitter at Mnar Muh, where I'll continue to go behind the headline. See you next week.